to start by telling you a story of two young men. Let me first introduce you to Daryl. Daryl grew up in a rather poor area of a mid-sized city. His parents and older siblings all worked long hours to ensure he had a comfortable life. And amongst his peers, Daryl was often teased for choosing to study instead of hanging out and playing video games or basketball. Now, like most kids his age, Daryl wasn't immune to peer pressure. And then on their way home from school many afternoons, his friends would stop in a nearby park to smoke weed. Now, Daryl usually said no to their insistence that he join in, but on one afternoon, he reluctantly agreed. It was a beautiful day, and their last day of high school classes ever. Now, unfortunately for Daryl, and unbeknownst to him and his friends, he'd picked a bad time to do so. The local police had just stepped up patrols in the area because residents were complaining about kids in the park. Wrapped up in the excitement of Daryl getting high for the first time, none of the guys noticed two officers approaching on their bicycles. "What's that smell?" one of the officers asked, the authoritative tone of the police sounding all too familiar to these young men. They stopped. They looked at the officers and looked at Daryl, and then back at the officers. Daryl stood there shocked with a spliff in his hands. What had started out as some fun would have a huge impact on Daryl's life. Because of the problems in the neighborhood, the police were unwilling to give him a break, and so he was charged with drug possession. And having just turned 18, he was an adult, so he was prosecuted in adult court. He might just have been given a warning, but crime was supposedly on the rise, and no one wanted to take it easy on the kids from the bad neighborhoods. So on the advice of his court-appointed lawyer, who told me he didn't have much of a case, he pled guilty. Now, Daryl's criminal record would follow him from there on. All those hours spent studying felt futile because as a result of his record, he couldn't get financial aid, which shut the door on college. None of the jobs he'd hoped to get as a young man were available to someone with a criminal record. And so he found himself sliding in and out of a series of unfulfilling jobs. His life wasn't terrible, but it wasn't what he or his family had expected for him. He had been a smart kid, but he never got to benefit from the education that comes along with traveling. He never got to move out of the neighborhood he'd grown up in like many of his friends and his siblings, nor did he have money to save for his own children's education. Now, Daryl's story in Brush with the Law makes me think about Ryan. Also 18, Ryan grew up in a typical middle-class family. He got a car on his 16th birthday and spent summers and weekends at a cottage that his parents often reminded him had been in the family for 4 generations. Now, Ryan's parents worked long hours, leaving him with free reign over the house. And because they were rarely home in time for dinner, they usually left him money to buy takeout. Being an enterprising young man, Ryan figured that he could save half the money his parents had left him for dinner, buy weed with it, and then sell that weed to his friends to make a healthy profit. Each week, he'd go to a local college campus, he'd buy a couple of ounces, sell it to his friends, and repeat the process the next week. Now, perhaps it was because of where he lived, what he looked like, or given the fact that none of his friends had been in trouble with the law before. For whatever reason, he never worried about getting caught. But on the way home from a pickup one night, he rolled through a stop sign and got pulled over by the cops. When asked to hand over his insurance papers, Ryan had to reach into the glove box where he just stashed his product. Like Daryl, Ryan was busted. But things didn't take such a nasty turn for Ryan. The police called his mom, who met him at the station. And after some strong words and a suggestion she might call the family lawyer, the police agreed to let Ryan go. He was a good kid, from a nice family, and he was heading off to a prestigious institution in the fall. Ryan promised his mom that he wouldn't be selling any more weed, and he kept his promise. And he also put the money he'd made into a savings account, telling himself he'd pay his parents back some of the money they were spending on his education when he was finished. He graduated from university with big dreams and a bigger network. And he thought little about his arrest until it became apparent that cannabis was going to be legalized. While some people talked about the social benefits of legalization, Ryan's colleagues at work talked about the huge profits that could be made from legal sales. With the help of a mentor, he and a former classmate developed a business case and started pitching to venture capitalists. Their idea? To grow and market high-quality cannabis to baby boomers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, their idea caught the attention of some local investors who helped build the business. The only caveat was that Ryan would have to come up with 5% of the startup funds. With a good feeling about his idea and some reassurance he'd sold pot before, Ryan withdrew the money he said he was going to pay his parents back with and used it to found his new company. After a few years of hard work and with a lot of help, Ryan and his colleague, his friend, were growing and selling cannabis, and the product was literally flying off the shelves. By his early 30s, Ryan had turned the $15,000 he'd made selling illegal weed into a multi-million-dollar business. New Life Cannabis was a huge success. Daryl, meanwhile, continued to struggle. He'd had little luck finding steady work, and so one of his friends suggested he try the local cannabis store. Now, he didn't like the idea very much because of all the trouble that weed had got him in the past, but he was desperate to find a decent-paying job. He tidied up his resume, put his pride aside, and headed down to the store. Somewhat nervous and certainly apprehensive, he walked in. He asked for the manager and handed over his resume. A quick glance at his resume revealed his address, still in a very undesirable part of town. The manager asked him just one question: "Do you have a criminal record?" Now, hoping the manager would find the irony in his story, Daryl admitted that he'd been caught smoking a joint with some friends when he was young and that he'd been hit with a possession charge. Without skipping a beat, the manager handed him back his resume and said, "I'm sorry, but the law won't allow New Life Cannabis to hire someone with a drug conviction." And Daryl's story typifies one of the new forms of injustice stemming from the war on drugs. That's the inability of people who are its main targets to benefit from the fruits of legalization. See, cannabis legalization is all around us. The burgeoning industry has already created cannabillionaires, and their companies have gone global. But all the talk of economic prosperity has overshadowed some of the momentous social opportunities that legalization provides us with. Now, interestingly, I see myself as much more similar to Daryl than I do to Ryan. See, I don't think I was destined to become a professor, but my passion for uncovering the type of injustice I've just spoken about started at a young age. See, I always enjoyed learning as a child, but the classroom was not the place for me to do it. I was often bored and disruptive, and so I spent more time in the principal's office in the hallways than I care to admit. But these experiences taught me an important lesson. I got to see the profound influence that individual teachers and the school as an institution can have over the lives of young people. While some of us were suspended or expelled for acting out, similar behavior from other students was largely ignored. Now, I was fortunate. I graduated from high school with decent grades. Might have taken me 6 years, but I did so. And I went to university to study criminology. And when I did, something funny happened. I experienced a form of déjà vu. Not because I was getting into trouble again, but because I saw the injustices that I'd been exposed to in my school years playing out on a mass scale. As it turns out, there are few areas in our society where injustice is as apparent as it is in our criminal justice systems. Factors like race and socioeconomic status play a huge role in determining who gets stopped and searched by the police, who's convicted in our courts, and who's sent to our prisons. And as us criminologists know all too well, it's the unequal enforcement of our drug laws that's a huge driver of these inequalities. As acclaimed poet Tupac Shakur reminds us, instead of a war on poverty, they've got a war on drugs so the police can bother me. And I actually used that line from one of Tupac's songs in a paper I wrote in university. The chorus, drugs, the user, and the state. And the professor, Dawn Moore, I remember her fondly. It was the first time I ever got an A in an academic subject. She taught me a lot about what I'm sharing with you now. That for most of human history, drugs were not illegal. That our first drug laws were designed specifically to target Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latino populations. That Black people in America, for example, are 6 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than white people, even though they use the drug at similar rates. And that these same disparities exist here as well. Importantly, I learned how easily, had I slipped up, I could have been in Daryl's shoes rather than standing here now sharing his story. You see, it's this realization and a knowledge that I look like one of the primary targets of the war on drugs that's led me to add my voice to the calls for progressive measures to be included in our move towards cannabis legalization. I think making money is great, and Canada has a great head start in terms of building these businesses. But there's lots we can do to repair some of what happened under Prohibition. As a first step, we should ensure that our governments erase the criminal records for people who've been convicted of crimes that are no longer illegal. Pardons aren't enough. Pardons leave a record intact and simply signal that an individual has been forgiven for doing wrong or breaking the law. What we need is expungement. Expungement completely wipes any trace of that record clean, at least federally, and signals that the government was wrong to criminalize a behavior in the first place. Cannabis amnesty is a first step forward. Secondly, we must make sure that the very people who are targeted by the war on drugs have an opportunity to benefit from the fruits of legalization. To once have arrested and incarcerated a group of people for doing something, and then denying them the ability to benefit from its newfound legal status only adds insult to injury. Think about all the people in Daryl rather than Ryan's shoes. There are literally hundreds of thousands of Daryls out there. People who will not be able to find jobs in the new cannabis economy because of previous cannabis convictions. And these insults are only made worse by the fact that we now have former police officials and police leaders running licensed cannabis companies. The very people responsible for waging the war on drugs get to cash in, while the people they targeted are left out. And finally, we should be pressuring our governments to reinvest some of the tax revenues generated from the sale of legal cannabis back into the communities most harmed by Prohibition. Enforcing our old laws costs us billions of dollars. This is money that was given to the police, to the courts, and to our correctional institutions, instead of to our schools, our community centers, and our hospitals. We should be aiming to repair the very types of neighborhoods that Daryl wished to escape from. And this can be done through the funding of after-school programs, mentorship programs, and money to go to community health centers. I think the most positive thing about the situation we're in now, cannabis legalization provides us with an opportunity for social change that comes with its own funding envelope.